the next several weeks, we'll be looking at the Old Testament book of Esther. Much to the chagrin of my lead mentor, who said, "It made a lovely sermon, but you'll never get a sermon series out of it." As we begin today, I want to offer up a couple pieces of information about the book of Esther in general. First and foremost, I want you to understand that God is never mentioned in the entire book of Esther. The book of Esther makes no claims to the identity of her author. Theologians vary greatly as to which time period this sacred book was written. Some date it in the later half of the 5th or perhaps the early 4th century. Most modern commentaries place the book of Esther in the 4th or maybe 3rd centuries. This is a book of the Bible that is not preached on very often. And some of the modern theologians say the book of Esther, we see God moving all of history towards its final end in the redemption of Jesus Christ. The book of Esther centers around 3 feasts. First of the Feast of Xerxes, then the Feast of Esther, and finally the Feast of Purim. If you've not yet read this Old Testament book, I encourage you to do so as we work our way through this story. See, I think that as a born-again Christian, you and I can all remember times in our lives before we came into a relationship with Christ where we can say that God seemed far away, that perhaps God seemed distant. In fact, as many times you and I might say, it felt as if God was not present with us at all. When I taught discipleship courses in the other churches, I told my classes that I was teaching that if you are in a relationship with God, if you are truly in a relationship with Jesus Christ, and someone moved, I can guarantee you it wasn't God or Christ who moved. Now, like all of you, early in my walk with Christ, I was on fire. I did all of the reading I could. I absorbed all the information I could. And I wanted to tell anyone who would listen about the glories of Jesus Christ. Then in 2001, a series of events that changed my life, my relationship with Jesus Christ. See, I went through a time span of several years where I wasn't sure where God was. I remember asking myself, God, are you even here? And if he was present, which I know now he was, I had no idea in 2001 how to find him. So what did I do? We all know the answer to this. I did things in my life, I led things in my life as I wanted to. I took control of my life. Yep, some of you are already starting to do it. You got that smile on your face. Let's just say that me taking control of my life was an utter and total disaster. I worked long hours. I spent time away from my family. My marriage suffered. The relationship with my children suffered. But see, I couldn't understand what happened. What was going wrong? Everything I was doing before seemed to go so right. All I'd done is change my focus from God to me. Well, because I'm a little bit stubborn, if you don't believe me, you can ask my wife. I tend to learn lessons the hard way. And I'm so stubborn that I took control for like 4 years. See, I did the things the world told me to do. I bought new things to try to fill the void in my life. I went on to blame my wife for my unhappiness. I got short with my children. You see, I was under the understanding that the more I worked, the more money I got, the happier I would become. Yeah, guess what? That didn't work either. And then in 2007, we moved to Idaho, and my focus turned back to God. Brothers and sisters, as Christians, if we're honest with one another, there have been times in our lives when you and I said to ourselves, where is God? Where did he go? Times when perhaps we let the world take over. We make work our top priority. Times when we put money and power before God. Times when we let public opinion, the opinions of others, lives and what they thought about us become more important than how God saw us. Times in our lives where, as sad as it is to say, things became more important than the people in our lives or than God in our lives. From 486 to 465 BC, King Xerxes reigns as king of Persia. We see the word providence in the first verse of the beginning chapter of Esther. And this providence word probably refers to a small metropolitan region. Thinks perhaps encompassing a modern-day city. Much like the references in the book of Daniel 2:49 or in Ezra 2:1, Xerxes ascended to the throne in what we think to be November of 486 BC. It made Xerxes approximately 32 years old. The story of Esther spans a time period of what we believe to be about 10 years. See, at the time, Persia was in conflict with the country of Greece. And we have the opening scene where we have the banquet, which we're told is held in the 3rd year of the reign of Xerxes. And it's during this banquet, Xerxes is displaying his wealth and his glory to consolidate the leaders of the many provinces of his empire. And so he holds a 7-day banquet at his residence in the citadel of Susa. As Scripture tells us, there was an abundance of wine served, and this was custom at the time. Usually, though, someone, a wine steward, if you will, would stop the flow of wine when they were instructed to do so. Xerxes told these men to let it flow endlessly. This was done, of course, to emphasize Xerxes' wealth and power as king. His elaborate description we find in Esther of this palace found in these verses is unusual for biblical narrative. See, the Jewish people at the time period we're talking about find themselves in Susa. They're beholden to the glory, and this is hard for me to even say, of a pagan king. The Jews had recently experienced humiliation, reversal of fortune that brought them from Susa. But because of a covenant with Yahweh made with them when He brought their fathers out of Egypt, the ultimate destiny of God's people, talking about the Jewish people, was secured. Because, as you and I know, the Jewish nation would be delivered from genocide, and it would survive, the Jewish line would survive, to bear the Messiah. See, as we think of all the oppression that the Jewish people underwent, we need to remember that no matter which empire, nation, or for that matter, government that you and I can think of, the Jewish line survived. Why? Because God, the King of the universe, sits high above in His throne, and He's the ultimate ruler. The Esther story stands as a warning for whatever prosperity one might enjoy. Remember that it's short-lived, because the Christian and sovereign power of the Lord should be our greatest comfort, not things and power and placement. God in His throne reigns supreme. But at this time, there's a war council, and according to the book of Esther, Xerxes is married to this queen. Her name is Vashti. The word sounds familiar to an old Persian word, which means beautiful woman. Now, Vashti, being Xerxes' wife, has fallen from grace, and this event is recorded in the 1st chapter of Esther. Several days of drinking, let's just be honest, Xerxes sends for his queen to display her royal beauty before the men of Susa. The beautiful Vashti, in her royal clothes, he wanted to display her as a living trophy, to say, I am the king of power, I am the king of glory. And so what's he do? He sends servants to go get her. This was common practice in this day and age around Persia, to drink while matters of state were discussed. See, there's an old theory that the ancients believed that the more intoxicated they became, the closer in touch with the spiritual world they would be. Well, if you've read the 1st chapter, you know she refuses his command. And the word has a great, and the fact that she refused his word brings great embarrassment to him. See, he needed the men present. He needed those men from the different areas of his realm to obey his command when they went into battle. Yet in his own palace, Xerxes can't get his wife to obey. Many feel that Xerxes' drinking may have affected the command. Some theologians have said, had Xerxes been in a sober state, he'd have never given him such a command. But nevertheless, Xerxes is powerful and dangerous. And this is the real conflict in our story. The power of the Persian Empire, which would, and I'm getting ahead in the story, would be turned against the Jewish people. It needs to be pointed out that some see Queen Vashti's refusal to be put on display as evidence of her noble character, her esteemed character. See, she stood up to Xerxes and said, "No, I will not go on display as your sex object." This is something, of course, that Queen Esther would be accused of failing to do. By starting the book of Esther with Vashti and that whole conflict, we're setting up a comparison of the two women, the past queen and Queen Esther as she will become. The author of Esther, the issue of dignity and position of women in the Persian court, paled in contrast to the pressure and the threat of death of the entire race of people, those being God's covenanted people. See, in this situation, King Xerxes cannot afford to overlook Vashti's public defiance. So the king turns to his political advisors. Sounds strange to us, right? If Janet and I are having a problem in our marriage, do I turn to the Senate of South Dakota? No, but see, this was customary practice for the king to turn to these advisors, these men who were supposed to be experts of law and justice. We assume, now this is theologians, we're assuming at the time that there's no prior case on record, so we can't use a legal precedence to say, well, how was this handled a decade, a century before? See, according to the law, they refer to the expert councils or advisors. But we need to notice what he does. The advisors say issue an irrevocable royal decree. Rather than personal reconciliation with his wife, he issues this irrevocable royal decree that determines her fate. A decision that would strip her of her title and position. The suggestion is made that the position be given to a woman, and Scripture says better than her. Notice it says better. What they mean here is a woman who would be more obedient to the king than the current queen. So the royal written decree be similar to that in Daniel 6, 8, 12, and 15. Minikin, one of the king's advisors, who we really think took Vashti's disobedience personally. Now why, I'm not sure. Customarily, an issue between the king and queen, as I said, should be a non-empire-wide issue. But this Mencken expresses his personal anxiety and fears in terms of what's good for the empire, and in turn, he manipulates the king to achieve his own end. The statement's made that Vashti is said to have great influence over other women in the kingdom. Thus, if they see the queen's disobedience, they in turn will disobey their husbands. King Xerxes ends up publicizing the embarrassing plight by ordering what he himself could not accomplish in his own palace. It states that men should be rulers of their own household. What happened to Vashti after her disposition in the future doesn't develop in this story. The author of Esther, who is identified as revealing the working of worldly power, is in essence mocking the ultimate inability to determine God's destiny for people. The story is powerful. It's a story of powerful Persian men who are outwitted by a Jewish woman. We'll see how Esther faces two levels of conflict. One where she's a woman, and then secondly where she's a Jewish woman. Esther will succeed in having this idiocy decree reversed. So far, in the early part of our story, we have a little of everything, none of which I would consider to be godly. So let me ask you a question. Where is God in all of this? Like our passage of Scripture, many times we find ourselves in this type of situation where we thought we had everything under control. We may have tried to manipulate someone into doing something for them. Yeah, I want you to see the problems in how the king and queen are relating, or shall I say, not relating to one another. You and I both know, of course, that this decree is not going to be the ultimate answer. It's not always a question in relationship. It's not always a question in relationship of who should submit to who. You see, we all need to remember that first and foremost, you and I should submit to God as the one and only divine ruler in our lives. If you notice in our story that God seems a long ways away, and He's even somewhat hard to find. I wonder, do you and I relate to this situation? If I asked you today, can you identify where God is in the Esther story, what would you say? Better yet, if I were to say, where is God in your life today, what would you say then? Are the two situations different, or do you see similarities in the stories? There's always going to be times in our lives when you and I are going to ask ourselves, where is God? Is God really even here? I used to tell my discipleship class that if you feel a long way from God, you're the one who moved, not God. If you feel this way today, remember first and foremost, you're not alone. Well, how can we bring God closer to us? By practicing spiritual disciplines that we discussed in a sermon series last summer. See, you and I need to remember to stop trying to control everything. We need to go to God with our struggles. We need to talk to God in a conversation. Make it, brothers and sisters, a real relationship between you and God, where we have open, continuous communication with Him. You could say God made the first step. He offered Christ. We need to remember, if we can't seem to find God, maybe we're not looking in the right spots. Maybe you and I are embarrassed. Maybe we're trying to avoid God. Maybe, sadly, you and I believe we can do it without God.